Whoa! I never thought about that!
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unlock the absolute magic behind bringing static art to life. We've all grown up with it, right? We've all been entertained by it. But the actual science and the process behind animation, well, it's a literal masterclass in problem solving and human ingenuity. Think back to the very first time you watched a classic cartoon. Maybe it was Tom and Jerry. You're sitting there watching a cat and mouse run, jump, crash into walls, and fight in a way that just feels totally fluid and, well, real. But have you ever stopped to wonder, who is actually making them do that? Like, how do these completely flat, lifeless drawings move with such perfect smoothness? Well, here's the wild secret. What you're watching isn't actually moving at all. No way, right? Animation, at its very core, is just a brilliantly clever biological illusion. It's created by showing you many, many slightly different still images really, really fast. Specifically, if you flash about 24 individual images every single second, your brain gets completely tricked. This trick actually relies on a scientific concept called the persistence of vision. It's basically the phenomenon where your brain connects rapidly shown still images into smooth, continuous movement. The easiest way to visualize this? Just think of a simple flipbook. Every single page of that book has a slightly different drawing on it. When you look at one page, it's just a static picture. But when you flip those pages quickly, your brain bridges the gaps between the images. It blends them together, and suddenly, you're not seeing pages anymore, you're seeing motion. And honestly, that is animation in its absolute simplest form. Section 1. The Hand-Drawn Era. Crafting Classic Cartoons by Hand. Let's get into it. To truly appreciate where we are today, we really need to understand how this biological trick was first achieved. And it took an unbelievable amount of manual labor. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer dedication of early animators. Back in the day, classic cartoons were entirely crafted by hand in this painstakingly slow step-by-step process. First, artists had to draw the characters frame by frame with a pencil. Every tiny shift in a foot, every single blink of an eye, that was a completely separate drawing. Step 2, these drawings were then painted onto clear, transparent sheets known as cels. And finally, Step 3, they had to photograph every single one of those cels, one by one, in exact sequence. Just let that process sink in for a second, because the math here is absolutely staggering. For just one single minute of classic animation, artists had to create roughly 1,000 to 1,500 individual drawings. 1 minute of screen time equals up to 1,500 hand-painted pieces of art. The scale of that effort is it's mind-boggling. But animators weren't just, mass-producing random drawings. They were essentially acting with a pencil. They used a core toolkit of principles to make these static images feel genuinely alive. They had to perfect timing to dictate exactly how fast or slow an object moved, giving it a real sense of weight. They used something called squash and stretch, compressing and elongating characters to mimic the physics of real life, which gives them that natural, fleshy bounce. And they used exaggeration to push expressions and poses way beyond reality to make the action super fun and readable. These principles, they're literally the soul of animation. Let's move to and see how this builds into the landscape we know today. We're bridging a massive gap here, going all the way from the analog era, which was totally defined by paper, paint, and thousands of hand-drawn cels, straight into the digital era, which is completely driven by 3D models, software, and rigging. Section 2. The Digital Revolution. Moving from paper and paint to digital puppets. So this is where the computer steps in to take over the heavy lifting of that whole physical drawing process. Today, most animation is digital. Instead of starting with a blank piece of paper for every single frame, artists build characters inside software. Think of it kind of like assembling the anatomy of a digital puppet. First, they create the shape. That's the 3D model giving the characters its outward appearance. Then they build a digital skeleton right inside that shape. This process is called rigging, and it allows the model to actually bend and move at the joints. Finally, they add controls, which are like hundreds of little digital strings attached to the face and body, allowing the animator to manipulate the character's expressions and poses. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the workload has fundamentally shifted. The human animator is absolutely still the artist. They still pose that digital puppet frame by frame to create the performance. But instead of having to draw every single tiny millimeter of movement in between those main poses, the computer takes over. It calculates the trajectory between point A and point B. The software just mathematically figures it out and fills in those gaps, creating perfectly smooth motion. Section 3. Simulating reality. Building photorealistic CGI worlds. And once computers got involved, the potential just exploded way beyond stylized cartoons. We entered this entirely new era of simulating reality, where animation techniques are used to build completely photorealistic CGI worlds for modern movies and video games. The really crucial point here is that computer-generated imagery, or CGI, treats the software like a hyper-advanced physics engine. To trick your eye into believing something is real, the computer literally has to calculate reality. It calculates realistic lighting, exactly how light rays bounce off a surface, and how shadows naturally shift as an object moves. It renders incredibly complex textures, perfectly mimicking the exact look of human skin, woven fabric, or scratched metal. And it simulates actual physics. We're talking calculating gravity for falling objects, the chaotic force of explosions, and the fluid dynamics of flowing water. It is just a brilliant marriage of coding and visual art.
Section 4. Origins and Imagination. Where the illusion began.
Let's take a quick step back to reflect on this whole journey, because it highlights one of the most fascinating intersections of art and science in human history. When you track the evolutionary journey on this slide, you realize animation didn't actually start with computers. Way back in the 1800s, it began with early simple devices like the spinning zoetrope, which just spun images in a cylinder to create a brief loop of motion. Then, moving into the 1920s and beyond, pioneers like Walt Disney took that novelty and elevated it, introducing deep storytelling, synchronized sound, and iconic character design. And now, in the modern day, we have CGI algorithms calculating massive, ultra-realistic worlds down to the individual photon of light. So if there's just one thing you take away from this explainer, let it be this simple equation. Whether you're watching a scratchy, classic hand-drawn cartoon from 80 years ago or a modern, photorealistic sci-fi epic, the fundamental truth remains exactly the same. Animation equals art plus science plus imagination. It's never just one big magic trick. It's thousands and thousands of tiny, calculated steps, whether drawn by a human hand or calculated by a computer, all coming together to create something that feels entirely alive. It really changes how you watch your favorite movies, doesn't it? Knowing the absolute mountains of effort hidden inside every single second of screen time. So my final question to you is this. What other everyday illusions are you looking right past? If you want to discover more hidden magic and uncover the fascinating explanations behind the world around you, keep exploring. There is always more going on behind the scenes than meets the eye. Until next time, stay curious.
And that's just one tiny big question. Imagine what's next, subscribe, and let's keep wondering.